portraits to plays, films to fables, Anne Boleyn is the Tudor poster girl, easily the most studied, the most followed, and the most divisive of the six wives of Henry VIII. Her creation as an icon of history has built over time, both from those who knew her personally and ever since a fascinating figure for the world of lovers of history. To discuss how Anne's image has been created with me, I'm very pleased to welcome back Helene Harrison onto the podcast. Helene's latest book, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, acts as the basis for our conversation. So sit back and listen as we discuss the many facets and the many myths of this endlessly fascinating queen, Anne Boleyn. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 94, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn with Helene Harrison. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Helene Harrison, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, you're very welcome. This is your second time on the podcast, and we're here to talk about my favourite figure from history, which I'm by no means alone in, talking about Anne Boleyn, and your upcoming book, which is due out in July, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn. Before we get into that discussion, a few questions just for people to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short introduction to your background, where you grew up and what you now do full-time?
So I grew up in the north of England on the coast. I sort of grew up around history. We were always visiting castles, abbeys, ruins on camping trips when we were children. Always been surrounded by history books. My dad's very into military and naval history. Though history wasn't really always with me academically. I suppose I came to it quite late. I did history as a GCSE. But that was modern world history, so my introduction to the Tudors didn't really start until my A-levels, when I did a module on Tudor rebellions. And then I ended up doing history at university and started studying women's history, which led me to Anne Boleyn, which was the subject of my undergraduate and my postgraduate dissertations. And I actually now work at my alma mater, Northumbria University, in the university library.
Very nice. Can you recall something that when you were growing up maybe, or something that sparked your passion for Anne Boleyn's story in particular?
Well, like I said, my Tudor interest came quite late. I know a lot of people seem to form it quite early on. I mean, it really sort of started with me with Showtime's The Tudors, Natalie Dormer as Anne Boleyn. And I just sort of wanted to know more. I wanted to know how much of it was real, how much of what I was seeing actually happened. And then when I started doing women's history at university, we did modules on women in power. And I just wanted to know more, and it just sort of snowballed from there almost immediately, and I haven't really looked back.
It's a funny one, isn't it, with being a Brit? My history GCSE exactly the same. It was mostly from going back over 20 years now, but I think it was mostly around World War One, World War Two. And people, I think they have this perception, don't they, that as Brits we must just learn all of the history. But actually, it's a bit like a bit of 1066, the Tudors, World War One and World War Two. Anything else going on, unless you specialise, you don't really learn about.
It's weird because I know I don't really recall doing the Tudors at school at all. I remember doing the Victorians. We spent a lot of time in that sort of period. And 1066, you always study. I don't think you can get away from that one.
No, but then you don't do any more on the Plantagenets, which is...
No, you sort of skip forwards and miss out this massive chunk of really interesting history.
If you could, given the subject today, if you could jump in a time travel machine and ask Anne Boleyn a single question, do you have one?
Yeah, I'd want to know, did she really love Henry VIII? And if she did, does she know when that started? Was it early in the relationship, or did she have to get to know him before she could love him?
Yeah. I definitely think she loved him, but I think it was something that came over time.
That's my thought as well, but I would love to know for
Yeah.
sure. But I don't, it's not something I think we're ever going to know.
No, unless somehow some letters are discovered, or even letters, it's difficult to say, isn't it? But we are here today to talk
Yeah.
about Anne Boleyn, but through the prism of your upcoming book, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, which is due for release, all being well, on the 31st of July, just over a month to go. And actually, this book is, as I understand, it's a culmination almost of a decade of research that kind of started when you were doing your
Yes.
undergraduate, I want to say. And so, how does it differ from more traditional books on Anne's story?
Yeah, it's weird because it's actually sort of nearly 15 years, really. I started
Wow.
coming up with my undergraduate dissertation in 2011. So, yeah, it's coming up for 15 years. And even the title of this book, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, came from my master's dissertation, which was also called The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn. And it's what makes this different is it's not a biography. It is still largely in chronological order, but it's a discussion of different perceptions and interpretations of Anne Boleyn over 500 years. So I think the earliest document I look at's her letter written in about 1512, 1513, the earliest recorded letter we have. And we go right through the film and
Hmm.
television. I think the latest is Six, the musical might be the latest I cover. So we're going all the way through over 500 years worth of history, looking at how she's been portrayed and how that's changed over time. But the original idea was based
Hmm.
on Stephen Greenblatt's book on Renaissance self-fashioning, because my undergraduate dissertation was
Yeah.
on Anne Boleyn's public image when she was alive, and then it sort of expanded out to look at the 500 years.
Until reading your book, I hadn't actually heard that term of self-fashioning. So, do you want to maybe briefly explain what that is as a notion for people who might be interested?
Yeah, it's something that I hadn't come across until I was signposted to the book by my supervisor when I was looking at what I wanted to write about. And Greenblatt's book's interesting, but he doesn't actually discuss any women.
Yeah.
It's all men. So he looks at, for instance, Thomas More and Thomas Wyatt both feature. Um, but I wanted to expand out because I think the idea of fashioning your own image and being able to fashion yourself is such an interesting one
Mm,
because we only have that control while we're alive. We can't control it once we're gone. And
yeah.
even then, how much control over our own image do we actually have when we're alive? Because we're always being influenced by other people, and other people might be talking about us, particularly when it's someone like Anne Boleyn, who obviously was very well known by the end of her life, certainly. Um, so it's quite an interesting idea as to how far did Anne try to fashion her own image, and was she aware that she was creating her own image?
So it's about essentially it's structuring how you as a person want to be perceived by the outside world and the decisions you take in order
Yeah.
to curate that image effectively.
Yeah, and the most obvious example of that obviously is portraiture,
Yeah.
because then you're very deliberately creating an image. But, it comes through in a lot of different ways as well.
Well, it's central really to both Anne Boleyn's husband and her daughter. And
Yes.
particularly Elizabeth, how much she controlled her image via portraiture was a huge part of her own identity. And you start the book, so helpfully you start the book by examining portraiture and imagery around Anne. Notably,
Yeah.
you open with the well-known, albeit not contemporary, images of Anne that are known as the Hever
Mm.
Rose portrait and the National Portrait Gallery portrait, respectively. Probably the two most well-known images of Anne. What
Yeah.
impact do you believe that these two portraits have had on the way that we interpret Anne's appearance since their creation, given that they're not contemporary?
Yeah, it was a deliberate choice to start with those two because they are probably the two that people are going to recognize the most.
Mm,
Even though, as you say, they're not contemporary, probably Elizabethan 1570s, 1580s-ish. Though I know the Hever Rose one is being tested, so we might get a slightly more concrete date on that one soon.
Yeah, I do know that it's believed to be the earlier of the two.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I think that one's estimated 1570s and the other one is 1580s, if I'm remembering rightly. Um,
Mm.
but they are probably the most influential two that we have because they are the image that people think of when they think of Anne Boleyn. It's usually that face shape and that portrait that people think of. And when other portraits of Anne are said to be uncertain, we have, for instance, a couple of miniatures that could possibly be Anne, possibly be Jane Seymour. We've got the Nid Hall portrait. And I've seen a lot of people compare them to the Hever Rose and the National Portrait Gallery ones and say they can't be Anne because they don't match those facial patterns.
Hmm.
And that's not really a good comparison because they're not contemporary.
Yeah.
So we don't know how accurate they might be. There does seem to be a lot of similarities to some of the portraits of Elizabeth. So whether they've used the same facial guide to create a later portrait of Anne is possible. But they're very much the Elizabethan view of Anne Boleyn.
What's interesting is that even looking at those, well, firstly, I hate the Hever Rose portrait, and I know a lot of people love it, but I
I
hate it
do.
because to me, I don't think it looks like a human being. Like the feature, everything about, if you look at the features, and I mean,
Mm.
same with the National Portrait Gallery image, I suppose. I mean, the lips are just so absurdly small that in both instances, but in particular the Hever Rose image, to me, it just doesn't look like how any human would actually look if that kind of makes sense.
Yes, the Hever Rose one I do quite like because I
Yeah.
wonder, it's the portrait where we see Anne's hands, which I always
Mm,
wonder, was that deliberate? If that portrait was done after Nicholas Sanders' work came out, was that a deliberate statement against the six finger myth? So that's something that
possibly.
I would like to know more about the dating of that one. Was it before or after Sander? And could it have been a
Yeah.
deliberate sort of choice to include her hands in that image?
And you touched on a moment ago as well that the face, I think it, well, in the National Portrait Gallery image,
Mm.
is potentially loosely based on a portrait of Elizabeth. And actually, I had Sylvia Barbara Soberson on the podcast a few weeks ago. As I'm sure you know,
Mhm.
she's recently released a book, Secrets of the Tudor Portraits, and she was
Yes.
able to prove that that is indeed the case, and that that face appears in a portrait of
Oh,
Elizabeth, a portrait of Catherine of Aragon, and a portrait of Queen Mary I. It's effectively the same face four times.
right. I haven't read Sylvia's book yet. It's on my list to read, but I've been a bit busy
Oh,
with my own
absolutely.
books and editing. So sorry, Sylvia. I will read it, I promise.
No, but it's just where you picked up on that, as I said a moment ago,
Yeah.
about the fact that the face is likely based on Elizabeth. Based on
Mm.
Sylvia's findings, that's absolutely is the case, and therefore,
Mm.
again, based on what you know what you're saying, when people question these can't other portraits can't be Anne because it doesn't look like these portraits. For all we know, these portraits are very removed from how Anne actually appeared. It's until an elusive contemporary makes its way, because I believe there is one out there. I really do.
Yeah.
Until that day, we'll just have to keep guessing, won't we?
Yes, we will. Because I know there was a record, I think Eric Ives wrote that there was a portrait of Anne in the collection of Lord Lumley as late as
Yes.
1770. So that would be intriguing to know what happened to that one.
Well, I've got a theory on that. But it's not my theory. I was given it by someone else, and I've spoken about it since. But there's a lot to this theory. But essentially, it's that the Lyndhurst portrait in New York is the long lost Lumley with overpainting. But it's a theory that holds a lot of weight. And as I say, it's the theory goes that the Lyndhurst in New York is the Lumley with overpainting over the top. So I will share
Please
that
do.
with you afterwards so you can take a look because it's really interesting. So you also discussed the Most Happy or the Most Happy medal,
Mhm.
as it's also known. This is the only truly uncontested image of Anne taken from life. So can you expand on the political propaganda element of this and how Anne may have deliberately chosen the gable hood here quite specifically and what that meant?
It says on it that it dates to 1534. So we have a specific year dating that to when Anne was queen after she'd been crowned. Although I have seen some suggestions say the medal actually dates from around the time of Anne's coronation, although that doesn't actually make sense given the date on it to me. I think it's more likely the
Yeah,
medal was created in anticipation of the birth of a son from Anne's second
agreed.
pregnancy. We know she
Yeah.
was pregnant in 1534. So I think it was probably a prototype of some sort that would have gone into full production had Anne birthed a son. So that could explain why we only have the one survival, a prototype of some sort.
Hmm.
The gable hood is interesting because people so often associate Anne with a French hood. But we know for certain she did also wear the gable hood. She wore one to her execution.
Yeah.
So we do know that she did wear both types of hood. But I think the gable hood could possibly be a way of Anne asserting her position as queen. We see her wear it at these significant moments, like her
Yeah.
execution. It's a more, I guess, traditional form of headdress in England,
Yeah. It's
often
English.
associated with Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah.
So it's possible that Anne wanted to almost associate herself with Catherine of Aragon as her replacement, which would be very symbolic in the gable hood when we see Catherine and Anne so often pitted against each other. So I think that's a possibility that it was for continuity almost rather than setting herself apart at that point.
Yeah. And as you've also said, symbolizing her position as a Queen of England and not one with links to
Yeah.
foreign power that the French hood is so associated with. So
Mm.
early in your next chapter, which examines Anne as a mistress, not a mistress in the classical sense, but you mentioned something
No.
fascinating about Anne's greatest power. And that was that her role as someone more emotionally intimate with Henry VIII than any other figure in his life, be it Catherine, Wolsey, Thomas Cromwell. So, can you expand on this for me and outline when and how it shifted?
I think Henry did love Catherine of Aragon. I think that's important to say. I think he saw himself almost as her
Yeah,
rescuer from this difficult widowhood. She was someone safe to him at that point. He'd known her for many years. Um, it was very different kind of love with Anne. We see this much more intense, almost obsession with her. And I think Henry let Anne
mm,
in as he didn't with anyone else. And I think we see this in the love letters. Henry notoriously hated writing, and we have these handwritten
yeah,
love letters, often with quite decorative signatures. We have hearts and Latin mottos and all kinds of things going on in the signatures. And we don't have that with anyone else in Henry's life at all, none of his other wives. And I think it was this incredibly deep connection that Henry hadn't felt before and wouldn't feel again. And I think Anne's power came from that emotional intimacy that she had before she became his wife because her role changed at that moment of marriage.
yeah,
As his mistress, Anne could speak more openly to the king. She was very involved in the great matter, the annulment case, very politically involved. Henry was sending, people to Hever to keep her updated as they travelled to the continent. He seemed to take her advice and her opinions on board. And Henry seemed almost reluctant to let people in, but he let Anne in as no one else
hmm
did. And he seemed even more contained after Anne. Like he'd let Anne in and he didn't want to let anyone else in after her to the same extent. And I also wonder if
yeah,
that emotional intimacy that they'd shared so early is why Henry was so involved in everything to do with Anne's execution. Although he wouldn't see Anne, he was
yes.
ordering the executioner. He was interested in all of the details of exactly what was going on. And we don't really see that with anyone else in Wolsey's death, Cromwell, even Catherine Howard later on. We don't have this same level of Henry's involvement, I guess. He seems to shut himself off to them afterwards.
And I agree with you. I think he did love Catherine, but I think he loved Catherine in a way that was in the way people will often have their first love. Whereas I think of Anne as his great love. I
Mm,
think of her I believe she was the love of his life. I firmly
Yeah,
believe that. I always describe them to people as a bit like the
yeah,
Tudor Burton and Taylor, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, that kind of intense, can't live with, can't live without. And that it meant that the relationship was only ever going to explode in a way that it did because there was
yes,
such passion that I think it was only ever going to burn out. And I think you see that really in how he shifts once marrying
yes.
Anne. And she goes from this exciting mistress figure into him wanting Catherine of Aragon 2.0, just younger and more fertile.
Yeah, and I think the description of their relationship being sunshine and storms is very apt because they did
Mm,
have these massive arguments and then passionate reconciliations.
yeah,
And yeah, that was exciting with a mistress, but not so much with a wife who was supposed to be
the wife.
birthing his sons.
So Henry VIII's letters to Anne, as you say, clearly articulate his intense passion for her. We see these
Mm.
quite comical little doodles. I mean, literally like a love-struck schoolboy. He puts H and A, he wraps a heart around the letters H and A. Frustratingly, though, we have none of Anne's letters to Henry in return, or at least I believe there's one, but we can't say for certain. But what can we learn about how Anne was approaching her relationship with the king based on the language that Henry was using in his letters?
Yeah, as you say, we've got one letter possibly written by Anne, but no one seems entirely convinced by it. It could be some kind of later forgery. And if it is real, it was very, very early on in the relationship. It doesn't seem to fall later in the series. And it is difficult to judge what Anne might have been thinking and how she was approaching the relationship because we don't have it in her words. And even if we had her letters, they still would have been, I think, very carefully judged as to how she was responding to the king. We still probably wouldn't have her true feelings about it. But the sequence of letters is often difficult because we don't know what order they fall in either.
You outline how, just comparing, for example, Eric Ives versus Elizabeth Norton, they have totally different feelings on the order of the letters, don't they?
Yes, complete. Everyone seems to have a completely different idea on the order. There's some that we can vaguely place in, certainly within years, but maybe within months, such as when they're talking about the arrival of Campeggio or the sweating sickness. We can place those in particular time periods, but we don't know how the others fit around them.
Right.
So Henry seems to have been very unsure in a lot of the letters of how Anne was feeling. So it seems that Anne was almost holding the king at arm's length, unsure possibly of what his motivation was. She quite probably believed he wanted her as a mistress. Although again, we we don't know what they were saying in person to each other, so we don't know what other discussions were going on. But Henry seems to have been desperate to be on a more concrete footing with Anne,
Hmm.
to know what she wanted, whether she would agree to be with him. So there's a lot of, it comes across almost as begging from the king
Okay.
to be a bit more certain of what Anne wants. He keeps pleading with her to come back to court when she's at Hever. There's one letter where he says that Anne has delayed her return to court. She was supposed to be back and she's not. So there's a lot of frustration there as well. So Anne definitely seems to have held back.
So we can kind of guess maybe that some of the content of her letters would have been not necessarily treat him mean, keep him keen, but just a slight reticence, a slight distancing to keep him on his
Yeah.
toes.
Yeah, and I think she was very uncertain given her sister's prior relationship with the king. She didn't want to end up in the same position, but I think she was also very aware of trying not to alienate the king.
Hmm.
So I think it must have been quite a difficult balancing act for her in her replies. And the other sort of thing that really comes out in the letters is we assume they must be later letters because there's talk about some kind of physical contact between them. We
Okay.
have there's one particular letter which is probably one that most people have heard of, where Henry talks about kissing Anne's breasts.
Her duckies.
Yes, her little duckies. So we know that there was some kind of physical contact, probably later in the relationship, although, as I say, the letters aren't dated, so we're unsure. And there's been a lot of discussion I've seen recently about whether Anne was holding Henry off sexual relations or whether indeed he was holding her off sexual relations because of this intent to marry her, and they wanted to be sure of the legitimacy of any children.
Hmm.
And it could be that it was a bit of both, or that it was in fact a mutual decision. It didn't have to be one or the other,
Yeah.
which I think is also important to say because it is often said, was it Henry or was it Anne? And I think it's important to consider maybe it was both of them working together, deciding not to sleep together.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would make sense because they approached things very much as a partnership. If we look at, for
Mm.
example, when in the run up to when they're going to get married and they're rebuilding apartments at Hampton Court and Whitehall, Anne is directly involved in the architect
Yeah,
plans and all that. So I think it would make sense that they approach this as a partnership.
I completely agree. But I think it is often pitted as it must be one or the other. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to say they did often work as a partnership, and this
Yeah.
would have been one of the most significant decisions, whether or not they slept together.
You also talk about the imagery around Anne that was used, particularly the pageants, Anne's coronation. So, can you just talk me through a couple of examples of some of the pageants that were displayed at her coronation, and what were they symbolizing?
Yeah, there's a lot of falcon images used in Anne's coronation, as you'd expect, given that the falcon was her symbol. Um, so, I mean, the falcon is a bird of prey. It's not, we have Catherine of Aragon with the pomegranate, and then we have Anne Boleyn with this falcon, and it's very different imagery. Anne's crest could attack Catherine's crest, for instance, and I don't think that was
Mm,
necessarily an accident, although we know the falcon does also descend down her family line, so it's possible she took it from there as well. But one of the pageants, the first line I think is "Behold and see the falcon white," and I think the white is also quite important because white is the colour of innocence, of chastity, of purity. It's almost a
yeah.
direct commentary on Anne's reputation in her coronation pageant. And white is often used at sort of weddings and coronations and things. We see it across the years. But I think it may have had an additional sort of impact at Anne's because her reputation had been put through the mill a bit, shall we say, prior to her marriage.
Yeah.
So I think it's possibly a very direct assertiveness applying it to her crest that Anne's reputation was clean, despite the fact she was pregnant on her wedding, um,
Yeah.
which we do know. So we also have descriptions of a pageant featuring Saint Anne, who's said to be the mother of the Virgin Mary, so grandmother to Jesus. And obviously Anne Boleyn, Saint Anne share a name. So it's possibly sort of a suggestion or an allusion that her expected son she was carrying at the coronation, which of course turned out to be Elizabeth, would almost emulate Jesus and be this sort of exceptional ruler who would carry on the Tudor dynasty. So there's a lot of symbolism relating to Anne's sort of reputation and the child that she's carrying.
Chapter 4 examines Anne as a traitor, and you examine a lot of the letters that
Mm.
particularly William Kingston was sending from the Tower of London to Cromwell. So, what can we glean really from Kingston's letters about Anne's time in the Tower and how she was coping?
I think we'd be a lot poorer if we didn't have Kingston's letters. I think we'd know a lot less about Anne's fall if we didn't have those letters, despite the fact that several of them have been damaged, and are
Hmm.
difficult to read in places. Luckily, there were transcriptions made before they were damaged, so we do know what they say. But Kingston's letters are really an eye-opener into Anne's mindset. We have ladies around Anne who are reporting to Kingston, and these include Kingston's wife, and Anne's own aunt as well is there with her.
Mhm.
And they were reporting to Kingston, who was reporting to Cromwell. And one of the things that really comes out from these letters is that Anne, she was very emotionally unstable at the time. She seemed to go from shock and fear to hope of life and being sent to a nunnery. She seems almost hysterical at times. And then at other times seems completely accepting of her death. So she sort of ricochets between all these different moods, and we have Kingston recounting them sometimes on a daily basis, what she's feeling. And this happened particularly before she was tried because she wasn't being told things. She didn't really know
Yeah.
what she was being accused of or who with. So she was sort of speaking unguardedly to try and figure out what she might have said or done and what she was being accused of. And some of these unguarded comments sort of implicated other people as well.
Well, Weston, that was how Weston came into the light, wasn't it?
Yes, she made an unguarded comment about, I think it was Weston and Brereton that she made unguarded comments about. And then they were arrested. And she recounted conversations with Henry Norris and Mark Smeaton while she was in the Tower,
Yeah.
which were then used against her as well. So even after she'd been arrested, Kingston's letters are still gathering evidence against her.
It's it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think we definitely what we see in Anne's behavior is that she was human ultimately. You know, she's going in those moments of intense stress, you're
Yeah.
going to have windows where for whatever reason you feel happier
Yeah.
and more optimistic about what might happen. And then you'll have those crushing lows where you are utterly convinced it's going to all go terribly wrong. So I think actually what we see is that Anne is having a very human reaction to a truly awful situation.
Yeah, and I think it's incredibly difficult for us to put ourselves in her shoes because we don't have those kinds of situations happening.
Yeah.
Sort of generally in England today, we don't have those kinds of situations. So it's difficult for us to put ourselves in her shoes of how she would have been feeling,
Mm,
which, yeah, it makes it almost harder to understand what was happening at the time because we can't understand what she was feeling at all.
yeah. And people will often comment they believed so fervently in the afterlife that life wasn't viewed as important because they firmly
Mm.
believed that after death they would go on to something else. But whilst that's ostensibly true, they did believe much more fervently than people do now. People still wouldn't have wanted to die, you know?
No, and especially not in that
No,
manner.
exactly. Well, the charges, obviously, against Anne at her trial, they're explosive, they're sh deeply shocking, and they're
Mm.
deliberately so, and they're done to blacken her
Yeah.
reputation. And you examine this in quite a
Mm.
big way in the book. Would you say that actually the fact that the charges were so shocking, did it have the desired effect of shocking people, or in some respects, did it actually have a slightly opposite reaction and people began to believe, hang on, this is just too extreme, and therefore they began to doubt her guilt?
It did almost backfire,
Yeah,
almost straight away. After her death, we have people questioning, did this really happen? So the charges were designed to blacken Anne's name as far as they possibly could. And I think that's why it wasn't just one or two men she was accused with, it was five, it was her own brother.
yeah,
They tried to make it as shocking as possible. And maybe they tried to make it so shocking so that people wouldn't question it.
yeah,
Maybe if people were so engaged and shocked by what she was said to have done, they wouldn't think too deeply about it.
yeah.
But people did begin to doubt it.
Yeah, I think what massively helped them as well, though, is Anne's own story because she had broken the mold so significantly and done what many believed would be impossible. You know,
Mm.
a relatively a well-born but not super high nobility female displacing a Spanish princess. So I think Anne's, well, uniqueness, I suppose, almost made would have probably made the accusations more believable because this is a woman who has so broken the mold already.
Yes, and perhaps that is was part of Cromwell's thinking at the time, is that she has done what no one expected. So maybe she would carry on to do what no one would expect anyone to do. And
Uh,
we even have the Imperial Ambassador Chapuis, who certainly wasn't one of Anne's biggest fans,
no,
reporting that the charges against her seem to be based on rumour rather than any concrete evidence. We have reports of Henry VIII travelling down the river to see Jane Seymour, and the people would see this and go, hang on, Henry's already lined up another one. Maybe there's something dodgy going on here. So we certainly don't have everyone believing these charges against Anne, and the doubt sort of starts to creep in almost immediately.
so obviously, as we all know, Anne is found guilty and sentenced to death. She is beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536. She gives a speech on the
Mm.
scaffold. There's the account of her speech is quite well known, although there is still some doubt as to whether it's actually what she definitely did say. But the
Yeah.
famous speech that she gives, she follows convention, but she quietly
Mm.
exonerates herself. So how does she manage to do that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting speech because we still see her backbone and almost her fiery sort of nature coming through in it. But
Yeah,
yeah, so it's generally expected that people on the scaffold would praise the king, admit their guilt, and that they sort of deserve death. It would be sort of quite a, I don't really want to say generic, but it's a fairly sort of
colorless.
formulaic expectation, really. And Anne did praise the king and his kindness towards her, but she failed to admit her guilt, which would have been expected. She acknowledged the verdict and said she's been sentenced to get death and won't speak out against it, but she didn't actually admit any wrongdoing. So there's just that little sort of omission in there that she's refusing to say. And I think if the version that most people accept as Anne Scaffold's speech is correct, asking people to judge the best is her way of throwing doubt on the verdict without being explicit about it,
Yeah,
which I think
very
very
cleverly.
clever. And
Yeah,
it does speak to Anne. We know she was incredibly intelligent. She was witty, liked her poetry, had a way with words. So
hmm
it does fit with perhaps how she would approach this. And I
yeah,
think she didn't dare say any more because she was still thinking about protecting the family that she had remaining, her parents and her daughter, and she didn't
yeah.
want the king to react any more against them. So I think she went as far as she dared in acknowledging that it wasn't as it seemed.
Yeah, and judge the best. It is such a clever way of approaching it because
Mm.
she's effectively saying to these people, when you look back on my story, I want you to not believe without any sort of due process all that has been said against me. And I think
Yeah.
what is must be kept in mind is that people would have understood what she was saying here. The meaning wouldn't have been lost on people, particularly
Yeah.
those in the crowd of the nobility. People would have understood what
Yeah.
Anne was doing.
Yeah. I think that speaks to the time that these things were sort of, they understood what the different nuances were, perhaps more than we would today.
So in chapter 6, you explore Anne as a reformer, and you quickly
Mm.
determine that it's quite incorrect, and I always say this to people, to simply label Anne as a Protestant because she wasn't. But you also say it's
Yeah.
also incorrect to label her as a Catholic. So how do you think that Anne would have defined her own religion, if that's at all possible to even have a guess at?
Yeah, I don't know that at the time they really would have defined their religion sort of as we do today. We have these very sort of set Catholic, Protestant, Methodist, Anabaptist, whatever else
Hmm.
we might choose to use. And I think at this point, religion was still very fluid. It was still being formed. So I don't think there was these rigid structures. The term Protestant wasn't widely used at this point. We obviously have Lutherans and Calvinists active at the time, trying to spread their beliefs. But we didn't have these sort of split, separate religions. And I think Anne, she did still believe in a lot of the sort of Catholic tenets of faith. At the
Yeah.
end of her life in the Tower, she does still ask for the sacrament to be brought to her room. We don't see her reject transubstantiation, which is the bread and wine into the body and blood. But she did want to reform the church. Clerical abuses were sort of apparent at this time. Wolsey is probably one of the sort of biggest examples that we see, holding multiple dioceses and all this wealth. And, we do see Anne quarrel with Cromwell over where the money from the dissolution was going. Cromwell wanted to funnel it into the royal exchequer, whereas Anne wanted to use it for charitable and educational causes. So we do have sort of a mix of sort of Catholic and Protestant, or reformist, as I prefer to say, beliefs.
Yeah.
And I don't even know whether really Anne would have rejected the Pope if it didn't become necessary for her marriage. I don't know that we can
Yeah.
even say that for sure. She did introduce Henry to William Tyndale, for instance, but whether it sort of would have, whether Anne would have rejected the Pope had it not been necessary for her to marry the king, I'm not entirely convinced. But again, it's something that we're not going to know the answer to. It's a what if at this point.
Yeah.
And whether she would have become more reformist or more Protestant had she lived longer is
Yes.
another unanswered question.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I described her religion to someone a couple of weeks ago. I think she was a Catholic who felt that the Catholic faith needed a fresh coat of paint. I think she
Yeah.
felt that all of the tools were there, they just weren't being used properly, and that she wanted to reform the Catholic faith from within, not without. Is my sense on how she was approaching things.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it because the only sort of really sort of Protestant beliefs like rejecting the Pope, we see her sort of embrace because it was for
Means
a
to an
bigger
end.
purpose.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not convinced she actually sort of fully believed in it. So yeah, I think you're right, and she did want to sort of reform the Catholic Church from within, ideally.
So you also discuss John Fox, who is a notorious
Mm.
figure, famously critical
Yeah.
of female rule, particularly against Mary Queen of Scots, but he had nothing but positives to say of
Mm.
Anne Boleyn, as best I can tell. Do you think this is entirely driven,
Yeah.
though, purely by Anne's position as a reformer, rather than a personal liking of her character, especially as he probably wouldn't have ever known her personally?
No, I don't think Fox ever did know Anne personally. I think he had probably heard stories. Maybe he knew people who knew Anne. Um, but Fox's work is essentially propaganda. We can't get away from that. It has a particular purpose to it. Um, so I think Fox's personal sort of liking or disliking of Anne, he probably saw as fairly irrelevant to what he was
Yeah.
writing. He wanted to sort of promote the religion that he believed in, using people who seemed to share at least some of his beliefs or acted in a way that forwarded what he believed in. As we said, I'm not convinced Anne was a Protestant, but she essentially was the catalyst for the break with Rome, which I think Fox did fully believe in and support. Anne's reformist views were more important to Fox than her character or her gender. Because, as you've said, Fox didn't really like or appreciate women. He didn't seem to respect women or their views, but he would manipulate and use stories essentially for his own purposes. And I think given
Yeah.
that Anne was almost a pivotal catalyst in what became the English Reformation, it would have seemed very odd if he hadn't included her and if he hadn't been positive about her.
Well, on the total flip side of that, this version of Anne is, of course, the one created by Nicholas Sander. It's Sander who I think we can
Yeah.
undoubtedly say created the monstrous image of Anne, the whole goiter and a large tooth and the the six fingers and all the rest of it. How much weight do you think Sanders'
Yep.
interpretation of Anne still holds with people today?
I think it's still quite influential, even for people who quite possibly have never heard of Nicholas Sander, have never read his text on the rise and growth of the Anglican schism. The sixth finger seems to still be particularly persistent today. I think we still see that in
Mm,
Philippa Gregory. But there's also been, I've noticed recently, an uptake in points of view on social media, particularly, that says Anne must have been beautiful for the king to fall in love with her. But the contemporary accounts never describe her as beautiful. She seems to be sort of fairly plain. No one has much good to say about her looks. And the appeal seems to have been in her wit and her charm and her charisma. Um,
mm.
and I think it is still particularly persistent, and I don't really understand why, particularly given a lot of people haven't read Sanders' work at all. And Sanders often the source that people cite for Anne being a witch, along with the idea that it was one of the charges against her, which we know it wasn't. And yeah, that also seems to be particularly sticking at the moment, is the idea that Anne was a witch. But Sander never actually suggests that Anne was a witch at all. That's not actually where it comes from at
Yeah.
all. He portrays her as a heretic. So Sanders'
Mm.
works, it still seems to have a lot of influence, but it's also being misread and passed on incorrectly.
So you also explore interpretations of Anne as a tragic heroine, and that image of her as
Mm.
this tragic heroine, it really takes hold in the Victorian era. And I didn't know just how much Queen Victoria took a real interest in Anne's story. So can you explain a couple of examples of how we see that in Queen Victoria's reign?
Yeah, well, the Victorians seem to like to romanticize things, and we see this a lot with Anne. There's a lot of paintings created at the time that show this very romantic version of her and Henry, particularly during their courtship. But we also have that iconic image of Anne with Princess Elizabeth in the Tower as well, that seems to appear on quite a few books and things like that. But we actually have Queen Victoria writing in her diary when she was still Princess Victoria, this is before she became Queen, that she had visited Hever Castle, and she'd ridden her horse. And, maybe this sort of visit sparked a real interest. Maybe it was that visit where she became fascinated with this sort of previous queen. She knew she was in the line of succession, the next in line, once William IV came to the throne and didn't have any children. We know Victoria sort of had studied the succession and knew where she was. So perhaps she was
Mm.
interested in this former queen consort who had this sort of this fall that no one expected, and but who still seemed to be very respected. So I think it's possible that that's where her interest started. And we then see in Victoria's reign, we have excavations in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, in the Tower of London, where Anne's buried. And the excavations led to the laying of the marker stones, including for Anne's grave. Well, there are two different accounts of the excavations which seem to have people buried in different
Mm.
places. So, for instance, one account says that George Boleyn was buried next to his wife Jane. In another account, they're buried at opposite ends. So there's still some confusion about who is buried where, but they all have individual marker stones in the chapel, which people will know if they've visited. Though the exact location of Anne's body is unknown at this point. The
Mm.
graves have all been disturbed multiple times over the years. And I think Alfred Hawkins has suggested the bones could be scattered over a wide radius by
Yeah.
now.
I mean, he's firmly of the belief that the bones that rest below the plaques are not the bones of the people that they say they are.
Yeah,
He's adamant that he's like, there's no chance at all.
yeah. So, yeah, I was just going to say it's likely that none of the bodies actually lie where the
Yeah.
markers are at all. But so Queen Victoria did do a lot to bring Anne back into the public eye. She now has a marker stone, despite that probably not being where she's actually buried.
Mm.
And yeah, we just I think Prince Albert probably did a lot there as well. He was very interested in architecture and sort of bringing sort of history back to life. So I think he probably had quite a big influence on Victoria as well, though I think that early visit to Hever probably instilled quite a lot in her.
Interestingly, it also seems that the Victorians really struggled to categorize Anne. That there was definitely this feeling that she was innocent, but they kind of struggled to accept it nonetheless. So what was driving this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because a lot of the texts, for instance, the Strickland sisters, there's a lot of contradictions in there about Anne and about how
Mm,
they feel about Anne. So yeah, it does seem that the Victorians didn't quite know what to do with Anne. So I think they almost romanticized her and made her into this mythical figure almost because they didn't quite know how to approach the history.
mm,
And I think the Victorian sense of morality in a woman's place was probably also influential there, that women were supposed to, you know, be obedient to their husbands. And we know Anne certainly argued with Henry. So I think it's quite a difficult question to answer just because the Victorians almost romanticized Anne out of history. They sort of removed her from the history and made her sort of their own figure. Um,
yeah.
so what they really thought about the history is difficult to gauge.
So naturally, a big part of the book looks at the ways in which Anne Boleyn has been portrayed on stage, in film and television. Is a very big part of Anne's story for modern audiences, as you yourself said earlier. For you, it was
Mm.
Natalie Dormer. For me, it was Geneviève Bujold. Now, save for Firebrand, which focuses on Catherine Parr's story, Anne is easily the most dominant wife in terms of fictional portrayals. We see her storyline, even in storylines where it's the six wives,
Yeah,
Anne tends to dominate. She'll be played by the most famous person. We only have to look at, for example, the 2003 series. It's Helena Bonham Carter playing her. The other wives are relatively, I mean, Emily Blunt is Catherine
yeah.
Howard, but that was one of her very earliest roles. So we see Anne given this. I mean, Helena was the co-star alongside Ray Winston. Why do you think this is? Because she is only queen for 3 years. Why is Anne's story? Why does it dominate so significantly, do you think?
I think largely it's because it's controversial. Um, People like a bit of
Yeah,
drama. And Anne's story does seem to captivate a lot of people. It's often people's gateway into the Tudors, even if they then go on to focus on, for instance, Elizabeth, or if they switch to a different wife. It's often Anne that's the gate seems to be the gateway in. I'm not saying it is for everyone, but that seems to be sort of the general consensus. And once people get into starting to look at Anne, I think part of the addiction is that we have some documents and letters, but there's also a lot that's missing. So we only have parts of the story, and there's space for people to imagine what could have been. And I think we always like to use our imagination, although as historians, we also need to be careful with imagination. So we have, for instance, Henry's love letters, but not Anne's responses.
mm,
We don't have sort of a confirmed sort of panel portrait in colour. We only have that medal, which has now been sort of partially damaged.
yeah,
So no one's really entirely sure what she might have looked like. Even things like hair colour is uncertain. So there's a lot that we don't know,
yeah.
and I
When she was
think
born?
that just engages people. Yeah, when she was born's another big one.
Yeah,
It's almost like it's a kind of soap opera with
yeah,
sort of Anne as the she's almost portrayed as this home wrecker breaking up this, 20-year marriage. And I sometimes I doubt if people would be so interested in her if she had provided the king with a son
Oh,
and not
agreed.
fallen from power quite so dramatically. I think her fall is this massive draw to people because
Totally.
she was the first English queen to be executed.
Yeah, I think, and it without wanting to sound too sort of reductive, I think people like her. She's kind of portrayed as a bit of a bad bitch, and I don't mean bad in the sense that she was nasty, but I mean just about, kind of someone you can get behind,
Yeah.
and I think that's part of it. I think that this image of her as a sort of, a queen spelt Kween, is part of what is driving it.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. And as you say, most of the series, even those that sort of purport to focus on the six wives, Anne is the dominant player.
Yeah,
And I think particularly in recent years, I mean, The Private Life of Henry VIII, I think Anne's only in it for about 12 to 15 minutes right at the beginning. It sort of ends with Anne's execution, um, which I think is one of the only ones that doesn't really cover Anne's story really much at all. And it's one of the earliest we have. So I think it's sort of a later fascination almost.
I couldn't help but howl. I mean, it's so ridiculous, but the opening cards, and it says Catherine of Aragon was of no interest. She was what was it? She was an ordinary woman, so Henry divorced her, or something. I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah, she was
it was
like
just
completely forgettable or something. I can't remember the exact wording, but yeah, it was something like that. And we
yeah.
don't even see her on screen. It's just this sort of title card, and then it goes to Anne's execution. And
I mean, it's a product of its time, isn't it? I mean, that I always chuckle
yes,
about,
it
that
is.
that woman who's trying to get a spot to watch the execution, and she speaks in a voice that's more clipped than the late Queen Elizabeth II. The woman asking someone in front to take off her hat. It's just so absurd that, that film, but it was a product of the 30s.
Yeah, it is. It's
Yes.
quite comical, and I don't think that's how it was meant, but it's how it comes across almost in the modern day. And of course, it was 1933, so yeah, it's one of the oldest ones, and it is completely a product of the time that it was made.
And on that point, then, so how do you think Anne's interpretations in film have been influenced by the conventions of the time in which they were made? So, for example, how does Anne of a Thousand Days being made in right at the end of the 60s, how does that impact the way that the version of Anne and how people think about that version of Anne?
Well, I think we're all influenced by the times in which we live, and I don't think there's really any way to sort of take that away. We're always going to be influenced by the times we live in. We just have to be very aware that we're always going to be influenced by those times. And I tackle this idea particularly in the Anne on Stage chapter, with Shakespeare writing right towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. I think we have the first staging of Henry VIII in 1612, so early in the reign of James I. And he portrays Anne as a mother because we have Elizabeth on the throne. It's quite possibly still contentious. There's people alive who may have remembered Anne. They'd be very old at that point, but it would have been just possible. And then we have sort of Francis Bacon and John Banks sort of writing during the Stuart period, Banks in particular, sort of the succession crises around James II being a Catholic monarch. And it all feeds into how the portrayal of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is tackled. And I don't think that it necessarily was deliberate. I think there were some deliberate parts in it, but I think a lot of the time it's just unconsciously we're feeding off what is around us at the time and what is happening at the time.
Hmm.
So interpretations are always going to play on the politics of the time, just as sort of modern interpretations, whether it's on screen, on stage, on the page, they're always going to be influenced by modern thinking. And we see a lot of discussions about Anne Boleyn sort of in the last few years relating to things like
Yeah,
feminism and the Me Too movement.
yeah.
And I think we just have to be careful not to put modern viewpoints on a woman who lived 500 years ago.
Oh, agreed. I think one of the worst things historians make is to psychoanalyze people from 500 years ago based on our own codes
Yeah.
of behavior, understanding of the way the mind works. These are people who lived in a different world. Yes, they still ate, drank, went to the toilet, laughed, but yeah, fundamental elements of how we see
Yeah.
society was so
Yeah.
removed from the Tudors that we can't
Yeah.
compare it.
No, we can't understand how they lived really, and they would have no idea how we were living nowadays, so
Yeah.
we can't put our own viewpoints on them.
Yeah. And it's a generational thing. I mean, even I think you said there about the fact that Anne, in recent years, the way Anne is portrayed is changing. I think even 10 years ago, the version of
Yeah.
Anne Boleyn played by Jodie Turner-Smith, a black woman playing Anne Boleyn, I think even 10 years ago, people that just wouldn't have happened.
No.
I think the big shift following, obviously, big shift in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, it's kind of changed how people are approaching interpretations, and I think that's refreshing, and that needs to happen. But it does mean that it's always going to be, I suppose. The problem with it is that it's the impossibility of ever being able to portray Anne as she would have actually been, because we don't know.
I think it's been quite, I think, controversial recently, some of, the portrayals of Anne.
Mm.
We had the Netflix series, was it Blood, Sex and Rock? I can't
Oh
remember
yeah,
exactly what it was called now, but that went down a very, very modern route that I wasn't
yeah,
expecting. And yeah, Jodie Turner-Smith, I think that was a bit of surprise casting when it was announced as well.
yeah,
And I do sort of briefly discuss that in the book as well. I couldn't not discuss the casting of the first black actress to play Anne Boleyn.
yeah.
And yeah, looking at some of the sort of newspaper reports of the casting and reviews, there are some quite controversial ones in there. So I think we're entering sort of a new sort of period of interpretation, I think.
Yeah, some of it, I think some of it, where I slightly get a bit frustrated is when we impose, again, modern
Mm,
interpretations of things on historical figures. Like I remember there was a play a couple of years ago in which Joan of Arc is non-binary, and I just thought that is making an assumption about a woman who died 600 years ago. I don't agree with that. I don't have any issue with people
yeah,
being non-binary, obviously,
no.
but don't impose it on someone who can't say whether they were or weren't. That I find a bit baffling.
Who probably wouldn't even have understood the concept at that point. So,
The
yeah.
concept, yeah, that I find baffling.
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of have these portrayals in modern times, in modern dramas, but I think it's also important not to impose something on the past that we don't know, we have no evidence for.
Out of curiosity, I think I'm going to know your answer, but what is your favorite Anne on screen? And by extension of that, is the depiction that you favor the one that you also feel is the most accurate?
My favorite depiction is Geneviève Bujold in Anne of the Thousand Days. It wasn't the
Okay.
first one I saw. It was probably about,
Thought you were going to say Natalie Dormer.
no, it was probably about three or four in, but it just sort of captured me immediately. I think Geneviève really has that sort of fire and passion that we
Yeah.
know Anne had that contributed to that relationship of sunshine and storms with Henry. And I think the film itself, Anne of the Thousand Days, is really beautifully shot. And I
Yes.
think that really helps, to be honest. Um, but I think the real Anne probably lies somewhere between Geneviève and Claire Foy in
I
Wolf Hall.
totally agree.
I think Genevieve has that fire and passion. She seems to
Yeah.
capture Anne's personality really well.
Yeah.
She has that charisma and just that sort of presence. But I think Claire Foy's Anne has that sort of the politics and the savviness. Even though we're seeing her through Cromwell's eyes, it's not a sympathetic portrayal.
No, it isn't.
I think Claire Foy really captured that sort of engagement that Anne had with the politics. And that's the one problem I actually have with Six the Musical is that one line where Anne says politics aren't her thing. That is the one problem I have with Six the Musical is that one line.
Yeah, I love the song "Don't Lose Your Head." It's a brilliant song, and I love that Anne gets her own introduction. But some of the lyrics are actually quite tropey when it comes to Anne's story.
They almost do her down in Six, I think, that she just comes across as this almost empty airhead, which we know she was the complete opposite
Yeah,
of. She was incredibly well educated, intelligent, witty, and yeah, I do love the song, but I don't think it does Anne any
yeah,
favors
I
as
agree.
to who she really was.
Yeah, and I'm so pleased that you said Geneviève Bujold and Claire Foy because I'm in complete agreement. I mean, they're my first and second place for Anne Boleyn by a mile. And in addition to what you were saying there about Claire Foy's version of Anne, we have the political side. I also think something that Claire Foy does beautifully that I didn't see anywhere else, including Geneviève Bujold, is that I think Claire's version of Anne beautifully articulates what I think Anne would have been going through basically all of the time, which is a sense of imposter syndrome. I think we see that in Claire Foy's Anne, is that this is a woman trying desperately to cling on to a very oily pole, and that uncertainty, that need to
Yeah.
the snappiness, the need to control was driven from deep-rooted insecurity about her position. And I think that is how Anne Boleyn would have felt most of the time.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Is it must have been just incredibly unsettling for her, uncertain.
Mm,
Even, when she'd agreed to marry Henry, I think there was still always this fear that he would give up on his annulment and that she'd be left with probably less than nothing at that point.
yeah,
And then being she must have felt trapped in her marriage, really, particularly, pregnancy after pregnancy and not producing this son. I think it must have just been so, yeah, insecure for her.
yeah. And actually, I didn't comment on what you said earlier about had she had a son, had she had Elizabeth, but then gone on to have sons, with her story of would she be as popular now? And I don't think she would be. I think that I think it's the irony that it's Elizabeth who goes on to
Yeah,
be the great ruler is again part of the what makes Anne so exciting is
yeah,
that it is this colossal irony. I think it's probably the biggest irony in
yeah.
history, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, when started looking at the historiography in my last chapter, a lot of what other historians were saying, there was a lot of Elizabeth in there,
Mm,
that Elizabeth was sort of Anne's triumph in the end.
yeah,
So yeah, I don't think Anne would now be so popular if it wasn't for her dramatic fall and the fact that Elizabeth was so successful.
yes, exactly. And I think it plays into that, Elizabeth defeating the Armada. It plays into that Englishness.
Yeah.
I think is a big part of it as well. You just mentioned there about the historiography of Anne Boleyn, particularly how she's been written about by other historians. After covering these interpretations, be it George Bernard, Eric Ives, a bit like in film and television, how much do you think is governed by the time that these books were written? And to that end, is it also kind of impossible to ever land on a biography of Anne that is exact?
I don't think we're ever going to get an exact biography because we're all sort of shaped by our own beliefs. Not everyone agrees on when she was born, on the order of the love
Yeah,
letters, on whether she loved Henry, on whether Cromwell was the architect of her downfall. There's always going to be something that is different because there's so much
yeah,
that we don't know about her. But it is just impossible, I think, to write about Anne without being influenced by the times in which we live now and by hindsight, knowing what happened
yeah,
sort of afterwards, how her image developed afterwards, how Elizabeth's reign sort of changed things. So I think there's a mixture of different things that influence how everyone writes about Anne, which is why
yeah,
we're never going to get a fully accurate biography because there's so much we don't know and we're all influenced by our
yeah,
own thoughts, feelings. It's always going to influence what we're
yeah.
writing.
Yeah, totally. Because, and that even comes down to just little things like I'm Team 1507 all the way. I firmly believe the later date of birth. So whenever I read someone saying she was born in 1501, as I know you believe,
I
but
do,
I
yeah.
always go, nope, you know, and I think that's entirely natural, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I believe the later date. I believe anyone saying 1501 is wrong, but that's as it should be. And it should absolutely be that anyone who believes 1501 thinks I'm wrong. That's as it should be until we can be certain. And unless a date of birth does erupt out of nowhere that puts it beyond all doubt, the debate should always go on and should be respected either way.
Yeah, and I think the date of birth debate is probably one of the most popular, I think, just
Oh,
because
totally.
there's, there's these two main schools of thought, but there are also outliers. So I think
Yeah,
Paul Friedman, the Victorian historian, suggested 1503. And while I think 1501 is very likely, I think it's probably the most likely. I think in a wider sense, it's somewhere between 1500 and 1504. I think it has to be before 1505 because Matthew Parker says that Anne was his countryman, meaning she must have been born in Norfolk. And we know
yeah,
the family seems to have moved to Hever in 1505 when Thomas Boleyn inherited it.
yeah. See,
Um,
I just take that as meaning she had Norfolk blood because maybe I'm just putting modern codes of thinking of things, but like I'm a southerner, but my dad's from Yorkshire, so
yeah,
I'm half Yorkshire. So I kind of I do sometimes I sometimes think people maybe overthink that one, and that actually he's saying she had some Norfolk blood because that's where the family came from. But again, we'll never know for certain unless
yeah.
something.
And as you say, it's open to interpretation.
Exactly.
It's not like he says she was born in Norfolk.
Yeah,
It is, it's open to interpretation. And I think that's half the fun of history is
yes, it
just
is.
that it's it's not very often 500 years ago you have a solid answer for anything,
No.
really. So that's half the fun of it.
Yeah. Well, finally, and I love you kind of end with this, is that you explore the word modern and the fact that it's applied to Anne Boleyn a lot,
Mm.
but you dismantle this very skillfully that it shouldn't really be a label that is attached to Anne. So in what way?
I think it isn't fair to label someone as modern when they lived 500 years ago because I think we're putting our own views onto someone who wouldn't have understood those views.
Yeah.
In labeling Anne as modern, we sort of lose who she really was, and we're almost creating our own Anne that we want her to be, rather than actually who
Yeah.
she was. And I don't think that's fair on historical figures who did live, they were alive, they had their own lives, they loved, they lost. And I think we're removing a lot of that humanity, and I don't think that's fair. It's not really what history's about either. History's about uncovering the reality as far as we know it, whether good or bad. And history should make you feel uncomfortable at times and question what you know
Yeah.
about now and the past. And we can't be certain about things, and sometimes that is uncomfortable, or sometimes you'll find something that makes you upset or makes you angry. And Anne Boleyn is a good example of where the present is almost taking over the past. We're sort of losing the
Yeah.
past, and we need to strip that back. I think we need to examine more how interpretations have changed over the years, and that can help us strip back what has been added over time to what we actually
Yeah.
know, what is there in the actual sources. And I think that's so important to know.
Yeah, and I completely agree. As much as I have described Anne as modern over the years, I've always felt as well. There are elements of her story that feel modern to us, but she wasn't a modern woman.
Mm.
And if she were to spring up if she were to suddenly pop out of the ground in 2025, I think she'd be completely horrified by lots of approaches. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what I found quite it's lovely. It's a great thing, but Anne does have this big following among the gay community, and that's great. But Anne would have been quite homophobic, probably.
Absolutely horrified, yeah. Yeah, I think in essence, Anne was quite a traditional
Yeah,
person. She wanted to marry, she wanted to have a family. And we see her express
yeah,
that in the letters that if she hadn't waited so long for Henry, she could already have been married and had children. Much as she was well educated and had that European continental education, she did still want what women at the time were supposed to want. She did want to marry and have children, and maybe she would have educated those children exceptionally, as we know Elizabeth had an exceptional education as well. So I think in a lot of ways she was quite traditional, but it's often the things that perhaps made her unique and made her attractive to a king, which are pulled out rather than the things that made her very of her time.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. It's been lovely to chat to you about undoubtedly my favourite figure from history. She's she continues to fascinate, doesn't she? So the book, as I said at the start, is coming out at the end of next month, 31st of July. For those who want to catch up with what you do, where can they find you on social media?
I'm pretty much on most social media by now. Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, all at Tudor Blogger. My website, tudorblogger.com, and my blog is also linked to that. And I also have a Substack, Tudor Blogger, The History Notes.
Amazing. And are you working on anything new at the moment that you're able to say, or?
I'm close to finishing my fourth book now, actually. My deadline for that is the end of August, so it's approaching quickly. And that's on Henry VIII's quest for an heir, his great matter, and the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So I am working on that now, and then moving on to book 5, although I'm not revealing the subject of that one just yet. But this book on Anne Boleyn has just been an absolute joy to write, and I'm so, so proud of it. If anyone has a negative review, I don't want to hear it, because I'm just so proud of this one that, yeah, I'm getting emotional.
Ah, well, if there are any negative reviews, ignore them. I mean, that was, but I mean, I was very relieved that most of the reviews of my book were positive. The only one that was more middling, someone gave it a 3-star review, and they said it was okay, it was heavy on text. And you go, "Wait, it's a book."
It's a book. It's supposed to be heavy on text. I'd be worried if it wasn't.
I'd be worried. Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, thank you again very much for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome.
Best of luck with the book. It's brilliant. I have read it, and I'm sure people are going to love it.
Thank you very much for having me, Adam.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Helene Harrison for coming onto the show to discuss her upcoming book with me. Next week, I'm pleased to be welcoming back another Helen Carr, onto the podcast for part 2 of our discussion on her recent book release, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. This time, we'll be diving into the story of Kings Edward III and Richard II. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me via Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for tuning in each week to the Tudor Chest. If you'd like to support the channel, a little review of the podcast would not go amiss. Thank you again, and speak soon.